Hi guys, did you have a good sleep last night? Tonight we sail into ancient Nordic forests and along frost-bitten fjords toward the scent of pine resin and the mutterings of long-dead carvers whose craft may have held more magic than we've ever truly admitted. You step lightly along a needle-strewn path just outside Uppsala, Sweden. It's cold, quiet, but not empty. They call this place the Whispering Grove. At first, you think it's the wind in the boughs, but listen closer, and it sounds like the trees are speaking directly to one another, maybe even to you. A myth maybe, but Viking mast carvers believed certain trees were born already knowing what they would become, and only some were born to be masts. You run your fingers along the bark of a tall, impossibly straight pine. The texture is smooth but veined with an odd pattern. Not natural exactly, not carved either. It almost looks grown. The elders believed these patterns were a sign that the tree had been touched by sea spirits while still a sapling. You don't choose the mast. One old carver said it chooses you. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes below deck on a long ship like theirs between the smoke, the stench, the clanging shields, and that permanent damp in your bones. But out here, in the quiet, you could believe for a moment that the tree is watching you back. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where this sleepy fleet drifts to each night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk deeper into the forest, and the light dims, clouds rolling in over Uppsala's sky, muting the late afternoon sun. You pass trees marked with strange cuts, small, deliberate notches halfway up the trunk, like tally marks or warnings. That's when you hear it, a low hum, not mechanical, not even particularly musical, just steady, rhythmic. At first you think it's your own breath echoing strangely in the trees. But no, it's coming from a grove just ahead. You step into the clearing and see 5 figures cloaked in wool and leather, standing in a loose circle around one towering pine. Each holds a tool, some axes, others long-handled blades used for stripping bark. One man has nothing but his hands pressed to the trunk. They don't see you, or maybe they don't mind you watching. The humming continues, a slow and steady tone rising and falling in pitch as they begin to circle the tree. This is no casual harvest. It's a selection, a ceremony. Here's where it gets a bit spooky. Historians can't agree whether these rituals were widespread or just regional oddities. There's no official Norse saga that describes tree whispering exactly. But local lore, oral traditions passed down through shipwright families tell us some believed the trees heard the songs, that the vibration aligned their grain, that it made the wood stronger. And you want to laugh, don't you? Because that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. But then again, modern biologists have confirmed that plants react to sound. Frequencies affect their growth, their water uptake. So, maybe the Vikings knew something we don't. One particularly intriguing theory suggests these forest rites were less about summoning strength and more about coaxing the spirit within the tree into peace. A restless mast was blamed for many wrecks, especially if the grain twisted near the crown. You hear a sudden crack, not thunder, not wood splitting. Just the forest adjusting, perhaps. The carvers pause and look up. They're listening. You crouch low behind a fallen stump. One of the men kneels, touches his axe head to the ground, and whispers something in Old Norse you can't make out. He then rises and gently knocks on the tree's trunk. 3 slow raps. Knock, knock, Knock. It doesn't answer, of course, but the men nod to each other and step back. This one has agreed. There's a quiet superstition you'll hear if you talk to the oldest boat builders in Scandinavia. They'll say if you dream of a pine tree 3 nights in a row, you must go to it, cut it yourself, and make sure your name is the first word spoken after the trunk falls. Otherwise, the sea will claim your name instead. Tonight, as mist begins to rise between the trunks, you find yourself staring at a tree so tall, so perfectly balanced, it seems almost sculpted. At its base, someone has placed a single bone bleached white and carved with runes, so faint they look like veins in the surface. A joke, a marker, maybe both. You wonder if the mast you sail on in dreams came from such a place. If it still holds some echo of the song, the whisper, the oath, and you realize the story of a Viking ship didn't begin at sea. It began here, where the trees murmur secrets only the bold or the foolish would try to understand. The cold deepens. Somewhere behind you, something rustles in the underbrush. But the tree stands calm, silent, watching, like it's waiting for you to knock. You return to the clearing the next morning, though you aren't sure why. Maybe it's the lingering rhythm of the chants. Maybe it's curiosity. Or maybe the tree did whisper to you. The carvers are gone now. Only footprints in the frost remain circling the chosen pine like the marks of a quiet dance. A few tools lie against the roots, a narrow-bladed axe, a wooden mallet with bronze studs, and something stranger, a roll of thick leather nearly 2 meters long, bound with iron clasps and smelling of sea salt and ash. You unroll it, careful not to disturb whatever ritual may still cling to the object. Inside, long, narrow strips of carved pine, each etched with unfamiliar runes, not the usual Norse alphabet. These are older, more angular, with delicate looped symbols curled into the corners. They don't appear decorative. They feel like instructions. One plank bears a phrase in faded ink. Lyfta vidare styrka andan. Raise the wood, strengthen the spirit. You look up at the tree again. Suddenly, its strength seems less about size and grain and more about reverence. No wonder they sang. These men weren't just carpenters. They were interpreters, translators of something the forest barely knew how to say. Back in the old days, mast carvers were seen as a different class of craftsmen. Not quite priests, not quite warriors, but something in between. They didn't just build the masts. They invited them into being. And once a tree was chosen, the first act wasn't cutting, it was singing. The early morning air still carries that peculiar note, half throat, half chest, almost like a hum, except it comes with words, just not in a language anyone has fully deciphered. Some anthropologists call them hammer songs, believing they were used to keep rhythm while working. But if that were the case, why did the singing begin before the cutting even started? You trail your fingers over the leather script again and smile. One fringe theory published in an obscure maritime journal in the 1970s claimed these early mast chants were meant to disorient wind spirits. Apparently, some Viking crews believed that wind left unchecked would gather around a silent mast like children around a sleeping bear, curious but prone to tantrums. Singing, then, was not just celebration. It was a spell of sorts. A musical ward against chaos. Modern engineers scoff, of course. They'll show you torque graphs and wind resistance simulations. But even they'll admit something strange. Some ships, all things being equal, seem luckier than others. Is it just better craftsmanship? Or did those old songs leave behind an echo? You step further into the clearing and find what you didn't expect, a circle of stones half buried in the soil. In the center, a small indentation where last night's bonfire must have burned. Charcoal outlines mark runic letters in a loose spiral, as though someone had carved while walking sunwise, murmuring lines to themselves. A sudden breeze shifts through the trees, bringing the scent of pine smoke and something darker, like iron filings and damp rope. You breathe it in and feel the weight of centuries settle into your bones. You crouch to examine the stone ring, brushing aside moss and frost. More runes, smaller and sharper, line the edges. Your breath fogs the air as you whisper them aloud, awkwardly, uncertainly. You don't know what they mean, but they hum in your throat. A raven calls from the treetops, and you look up, half expecting to see a mast already standing impossibly tall and crowned with sails. You shake your head. That's the magic of these places. Part memory, part myth, part mirror. You see what you're willing to believe. By now your hands are covered in dust and your boots wet from the frost-softened ground. You gather the tools, rewrap the leather scroll, and tuck one of the rune planks beneath your coat. Not to keep, just to borrow, for understanding. Historians still debate whether hammer songs were ever real or if they were invented centuries later as romantic lore. But one traveler's account from the 12th century mentions hearing deep voices in the woodlands singing to the trees as if asking permission. He was laughed out of court, of course, but the record remains. That night, you return to the forest one last time, unsure whether you're seeking history or harmony. You stand beside the chosen tree. There's a long scar now down its middle, fresh, pale, and straight. The bark has been stripped, and near its base, carved low, where only someone kneeling might notice, is a single rune Z. It's not decorative, it's a protection mark. One you've seen before on shields, gravestones, and the odd tattoo peeking from a sailor's sleeve. This one points upward, toward the sky, toward sails not yet raised and voyages not yet dared. You place your palm flat against the wound in the tree and hum, low, uneven. You don't know the melody, but somehow it knows you. Dawn filters through the canopy in a pale golden mist as you return once more. But today is different. Where the great pine once stood, there is only earth disturbed, reverent, and slightly scorched at the edges. The mast has been taken, cut clean, moved without a sound. No sign of drag marks, no snapped branches, just a shallow indentation in the moss where the sacred tree had rooted for centuries. You pause at the ring of stones. Someone has left a token atop one of them, a small, polished fragment of amber, warm to the touch despite the cold. Nestled in its golden core is a single black ant, frozen forever in its final panicked posture. The offering is unspoken, but clear what was taken was not stolen. The journey of a mast, it turns out, doesn't begin at the shipyard. It begins in silence and shadow, and in something half remembered by the bones. You follow the trail, not by tracks, but by instinct. The birds quiet as you walk. The air grows saltier, damper. There's a presence here, not watching you, walking with you. Eventually, you arrive at a low-beamed boathouse nestled near the water's edge. Its doors creak open with protest wood swollen by mist and age. Inside, the mast, laid out like a sleeping giant, its skin now peeled and planed, glistening with a thin coat of resin. But what catches your eye are the marks, faint, freshly etched runes that spiral along its length, barely visible in the dim light. You approach slowly. They're not just symbols, they're prayers, carved beneath the bark, hidden from daylight. These secret runes are what mast carvers believed lent their work endurance. Not just physical strength, but a kind of metaphysical resilience. The ability to carry a ship and its crew across storm, salt, and sorrow. Runes for strength, runes for memory, runes that had no literal translation, but were believed to be echoes of God's names, fragments too holy to speak aloud. One curious rune seems reversed, a mirrored algiz which typically symbolizes protection. Why would it face inward? Here's where folklore diverges. Some say the inward rune is a mistake, a sign that the mast must be discarded. Others believe it's intentional, meant to guard the mast from itself. Because if the spirit of the tree survived the cutting, it might remember the axe. You place your hand on the reversed rune and swear the wood flinches just a little, like breath caught in a throat. It's time to talk about mast ink. Yes, mast ink, not paint, not tar. A special substance made from powdered charcoal ground bones, often from oxen though, whose bones isn't always clarified, and pine resin sometimes mixed with drops of seawater gathered during storms. The result, a thick black paste that's pressed into runes with a bone stylus or fingertip. It's not about visibility, it's about permanence. One 19th century Scandinavian fisherman wrote in his diary, and yes, it's preserved in a small museum in Tromsø. The mast ink is not to be touched by sun or spit. Should either find it before the voyage begins, the journey is cursed to turn upon itself. No one quite knows what turn upon itself means, but he was later lost at sea. His ship found capsized mast broken. Coincidence? Sure, maybe. You walk the length of the mast again, running your fingers gently across the ink. It flakes slightly under your touch. Dry, fragile, alive. Another odd detail. Some runes are arranged in pairs, back to back, mirrored like the hulls of twin ships. This was believed to confuse sea spirits, particularly those that hunted, by following the scent of names. If they couldn't trace a pattern, they would give up the chase. One rune you recognize from the scroll back in the forest, an old charm for endurance. It looks like a curled fishhook tied with a knot. Near it, another mark like an eye closed in sleep. A carver once told a traveling monk or so, the story goes that no mast is finished until it has dreamed. He meant that the final rune, the eye, was carved only after the mast was left alone overnight to listen to the sea in its dreams. If it groaned or cracked during that night, it was deemed unworthy. You sit beside the mast as the waves lap softly outside the boathouse. The salt air seeps into your lungs. Somewhere nearby, a gull calls, once then goes silent, and now the mystery deepens. Historians argue endlessly over whether mast runes were functional superstition or decorative fantasy. But what's less contested is this Viking ships were among the most advanced of their era. Fast, lightweight, yet terrifyingly strong. How did their shipwrights manage it with hand tools and no modern measurements? One theory rarely spoken aloud in academic halls is that the runes themselves were calculations. Ancient formulas encoded into lines and curves, a language of angles, densities, and tensile logic. But instead of numbers, they used God's names. Was the strength of a Viking mast structural, spiritual, mathematical? You lean your head against the pine. It smells like salt and sun-warmed iron. You imagine it rising tall and proud above a deck slick with sea spray. A dragon prow beneath. A sky dark with gulls. You imagine that last whisper before the first voyage. Not from the crew, from the mast itself. It begins with an oath, not a formal ceremony. No raised goblets or echoing halls. Just a quiet murmur beneath the rafters' voices, barely above breath, as a group of men gather around the mast, like mourners at a funeral. Each one touches it in turn. Each one speaks something the others pretend not to hear. You're crouched in the shadow of a barrel, unnoticed, holding your breath. Outside, the tide murmurs softly against the rocks, and the gulls have gone curiously silent. The smell of whale oil thickens the air. A single lantern glows from the rafter above its flame, casting strange shadows along the freshly carved runes. One man kneels, his hands slick with something dark and shimmering. Not ink, not sap. Ale, a thick, bitter brew laced with ash and honey. He presses his palm against the base of the mast and whispers something in Old Norse. Another man steps forward with a flask narrow-necked, sealed with wax, and pours a few drops into a bowl already bubbling with heat. A slow sizzle. The mast is being sworn over, consecrated. This isn't just superstition. It's habit honed over generations. These oaths are older than the sagas. Viking shipbuilders believed that for a mast to stand tall and never splinter, it had to recognize its place, not just as timber, but as part of a soul-bound contract between man, sea, and the spirits in between. The ritual finishes with silence, a pause. Then slowly each carver walks away, all but one. You stay hidden, heart ticking like a drum as the final craftsman pulls something from a pouch on his belt. It's small, cylindrical, bone no too pale. It gleams as he rolls it in his palm. Then you see it a ring, a band carved from the tooth of a sea creature, perhaps a whale or something less easily named, etched with micro runes too delicate to read from here. He presses it against the mast and breathes a single word, Sjavarblad, sea blood, and for a moment the air in the boathouse shifts. Not colder, not warmer, just aware. Some say these final oaths whispered into the grain of the mast are what give a ship its name. Not the word on the hull, but the name the sea uses when it calls her back. It's strange how many old Viking ships bore no written name. They were referred to by deeds by fate, or by whispers passed between sailors. You remember the story of the ship that never reached England? No name, but every sailor knew it. Now let's talk about that curious substance again, whale oil. It wasn't just used for light. Mast makers would mix it with herbs and charcoal, creating a sealing balm rubbed into the base of the mast after the oaths were given. The smell was said to linger in the wood forever, a calling card that let spirits of the sea know this ship was claimed, not abandoned. Some fringe scholars have theorized that the strong odor may have helped waterproof the mast. Others suggest it attracted fewer insects, but to the carvers, its real function was spiritual. It locked the vows into the wood. And here's something rarely mentioned outside dusty archives. In some regions, shipwrights insisted on closing the mast's breath, with a final binding wrapping the base in thin cords of leather, soaked in the same whale oil mixture, and tied with exactly 9 knots. Not 8, not 10, 9. One for each realm of Norse cosmology. The idea was that the mast would pass through them all, Midgard, Asgard, Helheim, and carry the memory of every wave it crossed. A few old tales even mention carved bone tokens placed inside the mast itself, usually at the midpoint where balance was key. One such token was retrieved from a Viking wreck found off the coast of Gotland in the 1960s. It bore a single rune and the faint outline of a face, not human, not beast. The archaeologists dismissed it as symbolic decoration, but the fisherman who found it, he threw it back into the sea. Wouldn't say why. The fire in the boathouse dims as night deepens. You sit alone now beside the silent mast, thinking about those final oaths. You wonder what if they weren't just rituals for luck or protection. What if the mast born from a tree that once whispered in a northern forest needed to remember who it served? In an old traveler's log now crumbling in a Swedish archive, there's a passage that reads, "To forget the mast's name is to forget the sea's warning." You don't know what it means, but it doesn't feel metaphorical. A creak from above pulls you back to the present. The rafters shift. The lantern flickers. You stand brushing sawdust from your coat and approach the mast once more. At its base, a circle of symbols has been drawn in oil, some still glistening, others absorbed into the grain. You trace one with your finger, a spiral ending in an arrow. You're not sure if it points towards something ahead or something already buried. But you do know this: a mast once sworn over is never truly wood again. It's memory, bound, anchored, awake. Some things are built in shadow, not because of secrecy, but because that's where the spirits linger. The man they call the shadow carver does not work with others. No apprentices, no audience, no singing. He appears only after sunset, long after the hammers have gone quiet, and the salt air cools the sawdust in the air, and his rule is firm: his shadow must never fall across the wood. You find him, Or rather, you hear him deep in a coastal cave north of Bergen. The air is damp, thick with the smell of fish moss and something older. Something like old rope soaked in seawater, then forgotten. He's crouched over a mast stave lit by a triangle of lanterns arranged with ceremonial precision. He wears no gloves. His hands are calloused, blackened with soot, and he moves slowly, deliberately dragging a narrow blade across the grain, not to cut, but to speak. Every stroke is a whisper. They say he was once a respected craftsman, until something came to him in a dream. A voice, maybe. Or a storm that never ended. Some say he vanished for a year and returned changed. He never speaks of it. Only carves. Always in shadow. His masts are considered cursed by some, blessed by others. No ship he's carved for has ever sunk, but they've been known to vanish. Reappear months later, crew pale and silent. Or not at all. You crouch just outside the ring of lantern light, careful not to break the line with your foot. What is he carving? Not runes, not symbols. Something else. Eyes. Dozens of them barely visible, etched just beneath the mast's surface like hidden watchers. Each shaped slightly differently, round, slanted, closed, weeping. He never explains why, but an Icelandic fisherman once said, "So the mast sees the storm before we do." You shiver not from cold, but recognition. Because this is more than folklore, it's obsession. And there's one more twist to the tale. When the shadow carver finishes, he lifts a pouch from his belt and produces something odd. A scrap of leather, a lump of charcoal, and then, yes, unmistakably, a tooth. Human by the look of it. Old, worn, yellowed with time. He grinds it into the ink, carefully, reverently. The belief is old, obscure, and widely denied that a part of the carver must be offered to ensure the mast remembers the soul who shaped it. Some say a drop of blood suffices. Others insist on a tooth. You watch transfixed as he kneels and paints a single curling spiral near the base of the mast. The pigment glows faintly under the flickering lanterns, a glisten of bone and fire. Then he stands, and without a word snuffs out all 3 lanterns at once. Total darkness, silence. When your eyes adjust, the carver is gone. And the mast, still lying there, but different somehow. Like a creature breathing in its sleep. You swear its grain has shifted in the dark. Sailors tell tales of ships with masts like that. They say the wood groans differently, that it warns you. One account from a Danish trader in 1104 describes a long ship whose mast would creak twice before a storm, even under cloudless skies. His logbook states, 2 creaks, then the gulls vanished. That was always the sign. Naturally, no one believed him. But the ship still sits in a museum today. And you know what? There's a faint spiral carved just above the deck line, worn almost smooth. But there, shadow carved. Back in the cave, you take one last glance at the mast and think about the rule. The shadow rule. It seems theatrical until you consider what shadow is. A presence without mass. A shape without substance. Maybe the mast must remain untouched by such things. Maybe shadows carry memories the wood is not meant to inherit. You step back, heart slow, breath held. You leave the cave without a sound. Outside, the sea waits patiently. The wind stirs nothing, and behind you in the darkness, something creaks. Just once, like a warning. You don't mean to end up on the water, but somehow after the cave and the carvings it feels necessary. A small skiff awaits at the inlet, moored to a mossy post with frayed rope. No one claims it. No name etched into its hull. Just a faint spiral symbol near the bow. Familiar now. You untie the rope and drift. The fjord is hushed, wrapped in fog like old wool. Every dip of your oar sends ripples outward, vanishing before they touch the rocks. The clouds hang low close enough to imagine you're rowing through breath, not air. And then you see them. Ghost ships. At first they're just shapes. blurred silhouettes beyond the mist, but the longer you row, the clearer they become. Low-prowed, sleek. The outlines of sails furled tight against masts that stand like blackened spears. They don't move, but they're not anchored either. Just hovering on the water like thoughts that refuse to settle. You blink and one is closer, then two. No sounds of creaking hulls or slapping sails, just presence. As if these were ships made not of wood, but of memory impressions left behind on the water by vessels long since gone. The Ghost Fleet. Old Norse sailors believed that every properly consecrated mast had a brother mast, a twin created by its runes, formed not in wood, but in spirit. When a mast was burned or lost at sea, its twin would roam forever, drifting through fog-covered fjords, waiting for reunion or remembrance. You grip the oars a little tighter, and then something changes. One ship glides silently past. Its sail is torn, yet it doesn't flutter. The hull is scorched, but it casts no reflection in the water. Its mast bears dozens of faint carvings too distant to read except one near the base, an eye, closed, exactly like the ones carved by the shadow carver. You're not imagining this. That mast came from the same hand, or at least the same lineage. You row alongside it cautiously. Your skiff barely makes a sound. No creaks, no splash. It's like the water holds its breath. And then you notice something odd. The mast has no shadow, despite the pale light filtering through the fog. Despite the angle, it casts nothing on the deck. No slant, no streak. It simply stands. You remember the rule. The mast must not be touched by shadow, not even its own. You're not sure how that's possible, but here it is, floating eyeless in its wake, nameless in the mist. Somewhere nearby, another shape appears, smaller. A fishing boat, a rack. No, a raft, cobbled from barrels and planks with a crooked mast at its center, splintered, scorched, wrapped in seaweed like a crown. And from its top, a single bell dangles. Bronze, cracked, silent. You've heard of this, the bell ship. It's the sailor's myth of a drifting warning said to appear before storms or great loss. If you see the bell, the tale goes, you must strike your own mast and sail back. Immediately, or risk becoming one of them. You glance behind you. No sails. Just your little boat. No mast to strike. But something inside you, something quiet and bone deep, tells you not to look again. You drop your oars, let the current take you, and the ghost ships, they don't follow. They don't scatter. They simply continue gliding silently across the fjord like sleepwalkers in a shared dream. Historians dismiss this part of the lore, of course. They say the Ghost Fleet is a trick of fog memory and sailor's rum. No records exist, no photos, no artifacts. But some mast carvers keep a journal, not for words, but for sketches. And in more than one of them, tucked in the corners of oil-stained pages, you'll find the outline of a ship with a cracked bell and no shadow. Some stories aren't meant for museums. The mist thickens as you drift further. You hear a distant gull muffled by the fog, and then in the silence that follows the faintest chime, just once, a soft bell, not loud, but final. You don't panic, you just breathe, and in that breath, you realize something strange. You haven't been afraid this entire time. Uncertain, yes, but not afraid. Because deep down, some part of you recognizes this sea. These masts, these ships without names. You've sailed here before, maybe not in body, but in story. And stories like ghost ships always find their way home. The fog begins to lift, not with the sun, but with scent. You smell it before you see it. Pine smoke, sea brine, and the unmistakable tang of ink and old paper. The kind of aroma that belongs in a library bound with salt water instead of leather. Your skiff drifts gently into a narrow channel lined with stone markers carved to resemble twisted oars and dragon heads. At the end, a low, wide boathouse stands squat on the shore roof, sagging walls moss-covered, and door painted with a faded rune F. Fehu, the rune of wealth, but also of beginnings. You step ashore and push open the door with a slow creak. Inside it's dim and timeless. This isn't a shipyard, it's an archive. Shelves of driftwood planks etched with old mast designs, some so faded the grain has swallowed the lines. Bundles of parchment tied in fishing twine. Half-carved mastheads line the rafters, birds, wolves, snakes, and a particularly unsettling one that resembles a man mid-scream. But what draws your eye is the centerpiece, a full mast upright embedded in the floor, its base set into stone like a relic. It rises to the ceiling, impossibly tall for a structure this size, and covered entirely in carved runes. Some overlap, some interrupt others, some spiral endlessly down into themselves. You approach with reverence. Your fingers hover over the surface, uncertain where to begin. This mast is known in hushed circles as the Listener. According to obscure oral lore, it was never meant to sail. It was carved not to carry sails or bind a ship, but to record. Legend says the first carver of the Listener was a woman rare in the craft who claimed she could hear the sea speak when she touched timber. She built this mast not to command the sea, but to remember it. Her belief: every wave, every storm, every wind carries stories. And with the right runes, wood could listen. Skeptical, understandable. But here's where things get eerie. The mast doesn't feel like wood. You touch it gently, and it's warm. Smooth but humming faintly under your palm, as if tiny vibrations run through it constantly. Like something enormous snoring beneath. And the carvings, they change. Not quickly. Not in front of you. But if you blink, walk away, come back, it's different. A line extended, a curl reversed, a rune doubled. Historians dismiss these claims as tricks of light or wishful thinking. The mast never travels. It's never moved. It just stands there in the center of this forgotten building as the world shifts around it. But carvers come here. They don't always admit it, but they do. To listen, to press their palms against its surface and sit in silence. Some claim they hear voices. Others say they dream vividly the night after. Always of ships, usually of ones they haven't built yet. And one tradition almost never spoken of says that if you whisper a question to the Listener, it will show you a rune before you leave. You won't know where. You'll just find it etched into your tools, or scratched onto your boat, or drawn in ash near your hearth. And that rune, it's your answer. You close your eyes, place both hands on the mast, and ask the only question that seems to matter now. Why do they carve eyes into the wood? Silence, stillness, a drop of water from the rafters above, a gull outside. Then from deep within the mast, something shifts. Not a voice, not a word, just a feeling. You open your eyes and step back. There at eye level is a new mark, not a rune. A knot in the wood, one you swear wasn't there before, shaped like a fish's eye. Open, watching. Beneath it a scratch in the grain, deep and uneven. A crescent line, like a mouth. It looks like a face, a simple one, but unmistakably looking outward. You don't speak, you just nod. Because maybe that's the answer. Maybe the eyes aren't carved for sailors to see with, but for the mast to watch you, to learn your name, your weight, your secrets. And maybe in return it tells the sea what kind of soul you carry. You back away slowly, giving the mast a respectful bow. Outside the fog has cleared, but you feel it still lingering just behind your eyes. The weight of stories not spoken, only etched. And in the salt-thick silence of the boathouse, the Listener listens on. The next leg of your journey takes you inland, not far, but far enough that the sea becomes a scent, not a sound. You follow an old trail bordered by standing stones, their surfaces smoothed by time and rain, yet still sharp-edged enough to snag your sleeve. Each bears a single mark, a symbol, a name or a fragment of what could be runes or mere scratches. The path ends at a quiet clearing by a lake so still it seems more reflection than water. Here a ship rests half-built, skeletal, and haunting. No hammering, no shouting, no clang of forge or hiss of steam. Only the occasional soft scrape of a tool on wood. At the base of the unfinished ship, a woman carves into the underside of the mast, which has already been raised, but not yet sealed. She doesn't notice you at first. Or maybe she does, and simply chooses not to react. You've stumbled into the last step of something ancient, the embedding of sunstones. Before the compass, before GPS, there was Solstein, Icelandic sunstones, calcite crystals that bend and split light even on cloudy days. Sailors used them to locate the sun's position when the skies betrayed them. What you didn't know is that sometimes these stones were hidden inside the mast itself. Not for navigation, but for guidance. She pauses her carving to wipe a strip of sweat from her brow, then gestures with her chin toward the pile of stones beside her. Translucent, shimmer-veined, each one flickers with refracted fire even in the shade. She chooses 3. One she holds against the mast's grain, whispering something you can't hear. Another she rubs between her palms like a prayer bead. And the third, smallest, clearest, is placed in a notch, carved precisely into the mast's core. Not visible once sealed, not accessible once launched. There's no official record of this tradition, but certain oral histories from Greenland and the Faroe Islands mention sun-eyes crystals buried in masts to help the ship see the light even in storm and sorrow. One particularly intriguing tale tells of a ship lost during a solar eclipse. The crew panicked, but the mast marked with a sealed sunstone led them home despite zero visibility, despite the compass spinning wildly. When asked how the captain simply said, "The mast remembered where the sun had been." And that's the phrase you keep turning over now. The mast remembered. You watch as the woman seals the stone with a layer of pine resin and moss, then binds it with a ribbon of hammered copper. The final step is unexpected. She adds a single strand of her hair, coiled like thread, and tucked behind the copper. It vanishes as she finishes the wrap. Hair, blood, teeth. What is it with mast carvers and personal offerings? The belief was simple. If a little Iria mast could not find its way, if it didn't know who had made it, the more of the maker it carried, the deeper the bond. You step closer and notice something subtle. The mast's runes are different from the others you've seen. Softer curves, interwoven patterns, lines that suggest cycles and circles instead of protection or strength. You recognize one, the rune Dagazdi, a symbol of transition, dawn, and clarity. It's repeated several times. The mast, it seems, is not just for strength, it's for direction. There's another layer to the mystery here. Some mast builders, particularly in island communities, believed a ship could become lost, not because of weather or poor maps, but because the mast itself was confused, that it could forget its orientation, that the spirit within needed to be aligned with the stars, just like a compass. One fringe theory, recorded only in a private letter from a 17th century sailor, claimed that placing a sunstone inside a mast taught it the truth of light, so it would never again believe in the lie of shadow. Sounds poetic, right? But what if it's not metaphor? What if the mast truly learns something from the stone? What if it retains that knowledge? You ask the woman if she believes the mast will see. She doesn't laugh. She just looks up at the sky, cloudy and pale, then says, "It already has." And suddenly, you notice that the unfinished ship, though skeletal, though motionless, casts its own faint reflection on the lake. But its mast doesn't reflect at all. It simply rises, unbending, unbothered by clouds. There's something peculiar about balance. You'd think it's all math and measurement, a matter of weight angle and clever craftsmanship. But for Viking mast carvers, it was never just geometry. It was ritual. You arrive at an old dry dock carved into a cliffside where waves crash below and the wind speaks in sighs. Here, a half-submerged hull juts out like the ribcage of a great sea beast. Around it, tools lie abandoned, chisels, wedges, clamps, untouched. as if the workers stepped away mid-task and never returned. But one thing draws your eye: a mast half-raised, bound in ropes and tilted gently toward the sea. It's secured with heavy stones, not to hold it down, but to counterbalance a ritual still in progress. And at the base, a small hollow, deliberately carved and now filled with wax-sealed linen. You brush the dust away carefully, revealing a bundle wrapped tight in string. You hesitate, then untie it. Inside, a human tooth, old, yellowed, smooth from years of wear. Tied around it is a piece of parchment with just 3 runes drawn in faded ink. The middle one you recognize, Isa, the rune of stillness, ice, and pause. The others are older, archaic, possibly even pre-runic. You sit on the edge of the dock, holding the tooth like a riddle. You've heard rumors, whispers from coastal elders that a mast wasn't considered balanced until it carried a piece of its carver inside it. Not metaphorically, literally. Blood was too fleeting, hair too light. But a tooth holds stories. A lifetime of chewing grit, hardship, and survival. To give it to the mast was to gift it your essence, your burdens, your endurance. Some believed the mast in turn would remember the carver's threshold for pain and protect the ship from stresses beyond it. There's a tale of one ship, Rafentana Raventooth, whose mast was carved with 6 human teeth embedded at intervals along its spine. It was a merchant vessel, but none dared attack it. Not because it was well armed, but because every sailor who boarded claimed they could hear it gnashing in high wind, wood grinding like molars. Of course, no official record confirms this, and the ship sank off the coast of Åland with no survivors. But divers reported something strange when they reached the wreck. The mast was missing. Gone. Not broken. Removed. No splinters. No evidence of detachment. Just vanished. And nearby, resting alone on the seabed, was a tooth. Polished, inscribed, grinning up at them. You press the tooth back into the bundle and reseal it. You're not a carver. You know your limits. But as you glance back at the mast, something inside you stirs a sense of symmetry. A knowing that whatever this ritual meant, it wasn't just for the ship's benefit. It was for the carver's release. Giving up part of yourself to the mast meant it took the weight from you, a spiritual ballast. Some believe that without such a gift, the mast remains restless, forever seeking its balance. You notice the ropes holding this mast sway gently, though there's no wind. The hull creaks beneath. It doesn't feel dangerous. It feels alive. You whisper a word just to see if it hears. Minest. Remember. And in that instant, the rope tightens slightly, pulling the mast a degree straighter. Not much, but enough to make you blink. It could be wind, could be gravity, but you know better now. The mast is finding its center, and maybe so are you. Sleep takes you that night like a rising tide. Not a sudden crash, but a slow soak up the legs through the spine behind the eyes. And in your dream, you are carving. You are not watching from the edge. You are inside it, your hands rough with resin, your thumb sore from pressing into grain. The wood is warm beneath your touch, not from sun, but from something more internal, like it breathes. You are shaping a mast, but you are not alone. Beside you, others work silently. You cannot see their faces, only the rhythm of their arms, the sway of their bodies, the soft mutter of runes being spoken more than carved. You try to ask their names, but your voice doesn't carry. Instead, your knife keeps moving. Over and over, you etch the same shape, a crescent inside a circle, a symbol you don't recognize. And then, just before the mast is finished, you hear the dream shift, a hiss low and steady. You awaken not in your bed, but in a boathouse you've never seen. Lanterns flicker, your hands smell of pine and ink, and on the floor before you a mast stands already carved, already bound, already dreamed. And you know something you didn't before. Some masts choose their builders in dreams. This belief is rare, whispered only in corners of Norwegian villages where salt still coats the windowsills. They say some mast carvers receive their instructions while asleep, visions of ships they've never seen, coasts they'll never touch. The designs come fully formed. Symbols they've never learned flow from their fingers like memory. When asked how they knew what to carve, they shrug and say, "The wood told me." There's a record of one such dream mast built by a boy of 12 who had never held a chisel. He awoke after 3 nights of the same dream and walked straight to the forest, found the tree, and began carving. The ship built from that mast crossed the Baltic 4 times without crew. Each time it arrived at a different port, carrying nothing but salted fish and a sealed letter written in runes no scholar has translated. The mast now stands in a museum mounted vertically in a hall of silence. Visitors report odd dreams after touching it. Coincidence? Maybe. But here's where things get stranger. You find an old logbook tucked into the corner of this dream boathouse, soft leather bound in fish glue and stamped with the same crescent and circle you saw in your dream. Inside, no words, only sketches, masts, over and over, some curved like antlers, some twisted like braided rope. Each bears a single rune at the top, Iwaz, the yew tree, the axis between life and death, the world tree. You remember the feeling from the listener's mast, the hum beneath the grain, the way it seemed to recognize you. Perhaps it's not about tools or training or time spent learning to carve. Perhaps it's about dream recognition, a carver's ability to remember something they haven't yet lived. You step outside. It's still night, but the sky is lit faintly by the aurora ripples of green and blue, moving like silk above the fjord. The trees glow softly beneath them. You can almost hear the hum of the mast still inside. You whisper without knowing why. You are meant for something. And behind you, from within the boathouse, the wood creaks once, not in protest, in agreement. The next morning, you awake in your own bed, but the scent of pine still clings to your hands, and beneath your pillow, a single curl of wood shaving, carved, not by you. The sea is calm when you return. You're aboard a longship replica, now one used for cultural tours, all polished hull and quiet guides who smile politely as they talk about Norse trade routes. But you're not listening, because the mast is wrong. Not bad, not broken, just silent. You place your hand against it while no one watches. Nothing. No hum. No whisper. No faint warmth like the listener. No tension like the shadow carver's work. Just ordinary timber, hollow in its stillness. And you realize something unsettling. Not all masts are awake. This one is well made, beautifully varnished, perfectly aligned, but it's empty. Somewhere along the way, whether by oversight or fear, the carver forgot the soul. You glance upward. The sail flaps lazily in the breeze. The wind is strong today, steady. The ship moves fine, but it's like watching someone row across a lake with no memory of why they left the shore. Later, when the tourists disembark, you ask the shipkeeper about the mast. He chuckles and says it's made of laminated spruce, modern wood, machine-shaped, finished in a factory. Of course it is. You thank him and walk alone along the dock. That night you find yourself revisiting old texts. One translated from a runestone found near Tunsberg reads, "A mast that does not call out in wind will not return with the stars." It's a poetic phrase, but the meaning is debated. Some believe it references poor craftsmanship. If the mast creaks in the wrong way, the ship will fail. Others, particularly folklorists, say it refers to astral guidance, that certain masts not only remember the stars they call to them. You dig deeper and discover a fringe theory that Viking masts served as primitive cosmological instruments. Their runes were said to align with star patterns at certain latitudes, not to guide the ship, but to announce its presence to the heavens. One ship, Stjarnfadir, Father of Stars, is said to have made 7 return journeys to Vinland and back, more than any other, and every mast it carried was carved with star maps using a rune known as the Navigator's Eye, a design lost to history or hidden by those who feared what it might truly see. In the margins of an old, weathered manuscript, you find a curious note. Some believe masts do not follow stars. They attract them. You don't sleep much that night. Instead, you wander the harbor looking at masts, one by one. Some stand proud, others tilt slightly with age or use. Some creak in the wind. But now you listen differently, and at the end of the pier you find one, old, untended, dry wood cracking along the grain, but still standing. You place your hand upon it. At first, nothing. Then, a creak. Slow, rhythmic. Not the wind, not the tide. A call. Soft. Low. The kind of sound only made when something remembers what it was meant to become. You close your eyes and for a moment see stars bright clustered as if pressed into your eyelids. They shift, arrange, form a pattern. You open your eyes and they're gone, but the mast remains. And you realize some masts aren't silent. They're waiting for someone to ask, waiting for a wind worth calling to, waiting to be seen. You reach into your pocket, pull out the wood shaving from the night before, and tuck it into the mast's groove, not as a repair, as an offering. The stars overhead blink slowly, patiently, and the mast creaks once more. This time it sounds like a name, not yours, its own. The wind has shifted. You can feel it in your ears before you see it in the sails. A subtle tension in the air, like a change in key during a quiet song. The locals say this kind of breeze isn't from the west or east. It's from in between. A crosswind between memory and tide. You follow it inland again, this time to a hilltop where no ship should be. But there, surrounded by wildflowers and stones, stands a mast. Alone, no hull, no ship. Just the mast half buried in soil and lashed to an ancient stone ring. You walk slowly, respectfully. The birds go quiet. They call this place the grave of the keyless. It's a site known only in whispered traditions where masts that never made it to water are laid to rest. Not burned, not broken, buried upright like trees. Because even a mast that never sailed still remembers trying. You press your hand to the old pine, and something like static dances across your fingertips. A name rises in your throat. Not one you know, but one the mast seems to whisper to you. You don't speak it. Some names are meant to stay inside. This mast, unlike the others, has carvings only near its base. Subtle, faint. Many runes are incomplete, unfinished circles, half-made symbols. But one mark stands out, a double line split by a diagonal slash, a debated rune. Some call it a ward against imbalance. Others claim it's an unfinished bind rune meant to unite two fates but left incomplete when the ship was never built. You kneel at the base of the mast and notice something stranger roots. Tiny tendrils of growth, real roots, emerging from the bottom of the buried timber. Not naturally grown, but not entirely unnatural either. The mast is trying to become a tree again. You've heard the stories. When a mast fails to sail, it seeks to return to the earth not as lumber, but as memory re-rooted. In old northern villages, there was a belief that these masts were half dead, caught between the sea and the soil, and burying them upright allowed them to decide. There's an old carving tucked behind a church altar in Skudeneshavn that shows a mast sprouting leaves. The locals call it the sea tree. No one knows who carved it or when, but its roots twist around an anchor. You stand and look out over the hill. You count at least 6 masts in the ground, all upright, all weathered. One leans slightly, as if bowing. Another has iron nails hammered into it, perhaps an attempt to wake it, or to silence it. The wind picks up, and for a moment you swear you hear a low collective creak, like an old choir breathing as one. You sit on a nearby stone and think, of all the masts you've seen, this one is the quietest, but not in a hollow way. In a patient way, it reminds you of a sailor waiting at the edge of a dock for a ship that never comes. Not angry, not bitter, just watching. You reach into your coat and pull out a ribbon you'd forgotten you tucked away, a thin strip of copper hammered into a spiral once used to bind a sunstone. You tie it loosely around the mast's bark, not as a correction, as a reminder that it once dreamed of sails, and maybe it still does. As you walk back down the hill, the wildflowers lean gently in the breeze, and the buried masts stand behind you, like forgotten watchmen, not waiting for wind, but for remembrance. Fog again. It rolls in just before dawn, thick, low, and slow-moving like it knows where it's going. You wake to the sound of waves licking the harbor stones and the distant clatter of a rope against wood. There's a ship tied at the end of the dock. You didn't see it arrive. No name carved on the bow, no flag. Just a long, lean hull and a mast that leans slightly forward like it's listening. You step aboard. The wood creaks under your weight, but not in protest, more like a sigh of recognition. The sail is furled, the deck clean, the ropes coiled. This ship has been tended, but by whom? At the base of the mast, something glimmers. You crouch, brush away a fine layer of salt, and reveal a set of carvings, not runes, but a saga. A story told in image form, curling up the mast like ivy. The figures are small, a man with a crown, another holding a blade, and a third drowning. At the very top, a woman arms raised hair like waves, and beneath it all at the base a face, not carved in wood, but burned, branded. You run your fingers over the mark, and it's warm, faintly, as if the heat of the iron lingers. This is the tale of the Jarl's drowned blessing. You've heard fragments before. A nobleman, perhaps a Jarl, perhaps a king, once commissioned a mast carved entirely with his bloodline's saga. Every triumph, every oath, every betrayal etched into the wood from base to tip. It was said to be the most ambitious piece of mast carving ever attempted. The ship was built with a double hull meant to carry his family across the sea to establish a new kingdom. But the story never finished because the ship sank on its maiden voyage. No storm, no fire, just a sudden tilt, a groan, and silence. Some say the saga carved into the mast was incomplete, that it ended before the story could resolve, that an unresolved tale is a curse. Others believe the mast was too proud, too full of names and boasts and blood. And here's where it gets strange. The ship was recovered years later off the coast of an uninhabited island. The mast still stood perfectly upright despite the hull being half decayed. But the carvings had changed. Witnesses said the saga had continued new figures, new scenes, including a man who looked suspiciously like the Jarl drowning while others watched. No one knows who made those additions or when. You glance back at the mast before you now. The same story, the same Jarl. But here at the top of the carving, higher than you can reach, a small new figure has been added. A person sitting, watching. You, suddenly, you remember something you'd read in an old carver's notes, barely legible in the margins. Beware the mast that tells too much truth. The sea likes its secrets. You look around the deck, still empty, still waiting. You find a small, leather-bound logbook tied to the helm. You open it. One entry only. Mast finished today, runes sealed. He insisted on adding the betrayal line, said the wood needed to know. I warned him. Signed only with an unfamiliar mark, a triangle inside a circle. A bind rune for fate. You close the book and feel a cold wind stir. The mast creaks not loudly, just enough, like a voice clearing its throat before speaking again. You step off the ship carefully. Whatever this mast has seen, it is still seeing. Still writing. Some masts carry strength, some carry dreams. This one, it carries prophecy. And not all of it is kind. You're inland again, though the sea never really leaves you now. It's there in your skin, in your hearing, in the spaces between your thoughts. The village you reach is old. Stone houses pressed tight by centuries, smoke curling from turf-roofed chimneys, and narrow paths worn smooth by barefoot travelers, long returned to the earth. Here the shipwrights no longer build ships. They watch them fade. You're directed to a barn at the edge of town. Inside it smells like dust and dried seaweed, and in the center lies a mast, split, cleanly right down the center as if some unseen blade had passed through it without effort or resistance. It lies like a broken bone, exposed, unhealed, and quietly grieving. The locals won't talk about it. You overhear them at the inn, whispering about a fleet of ships lost on a cloudless night, their runes carved too quickly, too shallow. Rain came before the ceiling. The runes bled. One old man leans close and mutters, Runes that fade mean ships that fail. You return to the barn alone. The mast's surface is ghostly pale, where the runes once were. Just faint depressions, now like the indent of handwriting in a second page. You kneel beside it and run your fingers along one of the faded lines. It should be meaningless, but your fingertips burn slightly. Runes, you realize, aren't just symbols. They're anchors. Memory made physical. Without them, the mast loses not just its voice, but its purpose. There's a tradition you'd only ever heard once mentioned in a sailor's lullaby from Shetland. When rain takes the runes, the mast forgets the sea, and all her stars will fail to see. The implications were always brushed off as poetic, but the broken mast before you suggests otherwise. Some carvers went to extreme lengths to prevent fading. They'd seal runes with animal fat, copper dust, even blood and soot. Others would recarve them mid-voyage, risking splinters and instability just to keep the memory alive. In Greenland, archaeologists discovered a long shipwreck where the mast had been carved and recarved over itself dozens of times. Layers of runes overwritten, like trying to make the same vow stronger by saying it louder, and yet the ship still sank. No sign of storm or battle, just a slow, quiet failure. The mast, one scholar wrote, had gone blind. That's what this one looks like now. Blind. You find a box tucked in the rafters of the barn, tied with kelp rope hardened by age. Inside, small metal charms, each etched with runes, each drilled for nails. Mast amulets, not decorative, functional. Driven into the mast like medicine. A last-ditch effort to stabilize a failing ship, to remind the mast of its name. You take one and hold it to the wood. Nothing. Then another. Stillness. On the third, small silver spiral back to the air in the barn shifts. Dust rises. The hairs on your arms stand. The rune etched into it answers. The rune of divine breath, of communication, of voice. You press it gently into one of the faded lines, not to repair, but to honor, and you speak aloud. I remember for you. There's no creak, no groan, just silence, but it feels like listening. You stay a while longer, hand on the wood. Some shipwrights believe that even broken masts carry value not as tools, but as warnings. That a failed mast teaches more than a perfect one ever could. And in some villages they say this: carve not just to carry, carve to be remembered. As you leave the barn, you glance back once, and for the briefest moment you see your breath rise like smoke and curve slightly toward the split mast. Drawn, not by wind, but by memory. The sea calls you back one final time, not with waves or wind, but with emptiness. The kind of hollow that settles behind your ribs when something ancient waits for closure. You return to the coast, where jagged cliffs stretch like broken teeth into a gray horizon. There is no harbor here, only stone steps, carved into the rock, slick with salt, and time leading down to a hidden cove few would find by accident. There, nestled in the sand and mist, stands a mast, alone, upright. Its base is buried not in wood or rope or hull, but in stone. A perfect circle carved into the coastal rock, holding the mast steady like a sundial long forgotten. There is no ship, no anchor, no crew, only this final monument. You step closer, boots crunching quietly in the gravel, and place your hand against the wood. It's smoother than any you've touched before, worn not by sand or storm, but by the wind of time itself. The grain has polished itself. The carvings are shallow, but legible. This is the last mast of the North Wind. You've heard the name. A folk legend shared by coastal children and passed down in bedtime whispers. A tale of a mast that arrived from the sea with no ship beneath it. A mast that sailed on its own. They say it drifted into port during a fog so thick the town dogs howled at nothing. The mast stood upright on the waves, sail unfurled, but no hull, just water where there should have been a deck. No one dared touch it, except one boy. He was found hours later, asleep at the base, curled into the mast like a child beside a tree. When he awoke, he claimed to have dreamed of every ship ever lost, sailing through a sky of stars. The mast was hauled ashore, but no one could lift it once it touched land. Tools broke, ropes frayed, so they carved a resting place in the stone itself, and here it remains, watching, waiting. You walk around it slowly, reverently. The runes are unusual, fewer than most, but larger, spaced far apart, as if each was carved with deliberate slowness, not to say more, but to say only what mattered. Protection, direction, farewell. And at the very top, barely visible without leaning back, a final rune and nodis, the rune of need, of constraint, of necessity. It's not a cry for help. It's a recognition that the sea gives, but only to those who ask with humility. You kneel at the base and notice something tucked in the small crevice of stone, wrapped in seal hide tied with sinew. You unwrap it gently. Inside is a small figurine carved from the same wood as the mast, a sailor or perhaps a carver. Hands pressed to a chest. No face, just a spiral where the eyes should be. You leave it there, not to take, but to return. And now, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. A hush so full, it makes your pulse feel loud. A windless pause between the inhale and exhale of the sea. You sit with the mast. You listen. And slowly the world softens. Mist curls low and warm around the stone. Waves hush themselves. A distant foghorn murmurs once, like a final lullaby. The mast does not creak. It doesn't have to. It has said everything it needs to say. It stands here for all of them, every mast forgotten, broken, buried, burned. Every dream carved into bark. Every whisper pressed into grain. This is where their stories come to rest, and maybe to sleep. So now you sit back, let your shoulders ease. Let the tension drift down like a tide pulling gently from your chest. The journey's over for tonight. You've seen the forests where whispering trees are chosen. You've watched the shadow carver and the listener. You've followed the mast that drifted alone through mist and touched the one that forgot its runes. But more than that, you've heard them. The hum in the grain, the stories etched beneath the bark, the names the sea never said aloud. As your breath slows, imagine the soft sway of a ship in calm waters. No destination, no urgency. Just the gentle give and take of water beneath wood. Lanterns flicker along the deck. Somewhere, a sail flutters against a wind too small to be noticed. You lie back on the deck. Above you, the mast rises into stars, and each rune glows faintly, not with fire, but memory. Some blink like lighthouses. Others pulse like hearts. None of them hurry. Sleep comes slowly, like fog curling around a hull, like salt on the breeze, like the final stroke of a carving knife before a mast is sealed. You close your eyes and drift, not away, but inward, towards stories forgotten and wood that waits to be remembered.